Så min nästa gäst är professor i epidemiologi och folkhälsovetenskap vid University College of London. It's an honor, Sir Michael Marmot. Please welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you for a splendid keynote earlier today here at Forte Talks. Quite interesting. And you talked quite a lot about social injustice. And when I started to do some research before this small interview, I started to get a grip of all that you have done. It was overwhelming. So I contacted you and said, what should we talk about? And you gave me one sentence. Please ask me about social justice. So I will do that. I will ask you about social justice. Can you please tell us what you mean and how you define social justice?
Well, you'll notice at the end of my speech, the journalist who was moderating, she said, you said, social injustice kills. Why are politicians and others not listening? And it turns out there are very different conceptions of social justice. And as I looked, having written the sentence, social injustice kills, on the report of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, I thought I better try and get clear what I mean by social justice. And the first thing to say is that there is no agreement what social justice means. If you read what philosophers, political philosophers write about social justice, and there was a very well-known philosopher who died in Britain, Stuart Hampshire, and he said, it's not that philosophers disagree, it's that there is no agreement. I mean, there is no single conception. There are different conceptions. So the approach that I took was not to try and solve the philosophers' problems that they find insoluble, but to ask which conception would best fit what I'm describing in terms of avoidable health inequalities. And my guide in this was the American Harvard-based political philosopher Michael Sandel. And he says we should distinguish three approaches to social justice: maximizing welfare, promoting freedom, and rewarding virtue. And it's clear that there are philosophers who are signed up to each of these three. So my approach was, how would this help me understand avoidable health inequalities? So let's look at the first one, maximizing welfare. I work at University College London. The auto icon of Jeremy Bentham, that's his skeleton dressed up in his clothes with a wax face, is in a box outside the office of the president of the university. And Jeremy Bentham famously, founder of utilitarian philosophy, talked about the greatest good for the greatest number. And you might say that one advantage of that approach, let me think about not good, but health. Jeremy Bentham said the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but let me apply that to health. So what that implies is that a healthy prince and an unhealthy pauper count the same as an unhealthy prince and a healthy pauper. They're equivalent. Well, I'm a bit concerned about that, of just adding up the averages. Because let's say 2/3 are doing well and 1/3 is doing badly. That counts the same as if everyone's doing about average. And it seems to me they're not equivalent, they're different. And a simple adding up principle doesn't do it for me. Related to that is one way economists commonly talk about a simple adding up principle, is they provide a monetary value for a year of life saved. And not only does that allow them to add up the years of life saved and say whether this solution is better than that solution, they then, having put a dollar value or a krona or a euro or a pound value on a life saved, they can then say, what's the benefit of global warming or retarding global warming? And we can then compare that with the life saved by some other strategy, because we've got this common metric of dollars. This is awful. This is awful. That doesn't solve any problem at all. That's totally illusory if you think that's going to solve your problem. That's ghastly. So to ask, well, a 20% reduction in mortality, how does that compare with a slower melting of the polar ice cap? That problem isn't solved by measuring them both in dollars. It's totally illusory. So for those two reasons, one, that a simple adding up principle doesn't deal with distributions, and the second is it's inviting us to measure very disparate things with the same metric, dollars, euros, and I'm uncomfortable with that because I care about distributions.
So what do you want to see?
So the second is promoting freedom. Now that's interesting, but we need to be careful because right and left take different approaches to freedom. Milton Friedman wrote a famous book called Freedom to Choose. And for libertarians of the right, freedom is guaranteed by getting government out of the way. The only role for government is to lock people up if they commit crimes and to have a military to protect us from invaders, and not much else. Minimal regulation of markets or whatever, but not much else. So one approach to freedom is get the state out of the way and give everybody liberty. A famous libertarian philosopher, again at Harvard, says that taxation is theft. Well, if that's the case, everybody in the Nordic countries is being robbed because you have quite high levels of taxation. So one approach to freedom is the state should do very little. A different approach relates to what I talk about, which is empowering people, having control over your life. But that empowerment of people, having control over your life, requires social action. You can't just say, well, you can be powerful, because think of, I've been concerned, I mentioned about Glasgow, poor health in Glasgow. Think of some scallywag, some young man in Glasgow who is close to unemployable, he's involved in gangs, commits petty crime, doing drugs, alcohol, he has girlfriends that he abuses, a mess, total mess. And you say to him, well, you've got the freedom to be a better person. You could stop abusing your girlfriend, you could stop drinking and doing drugs, you could leave the gang, you could get a job, pull your socks up, be a better person. You've got the freedom to do that. Then we inquire into this young man's history. And it turns out that he never knew his father. His mother had a succession of male partners, most of whom abused this young man physically, if not sexually. They moved home about every 18 months on average. By the time he went to school, he was already seen as having learning difficulties. He got into all sorts of behavioral problems at school. As soon as he was old enough, he was in trouble with the police because of juvenile delinquency. Then he was involved in gangs. And when the psychiatrist got to him, they diagnosed him as having depression, anxiety, personality disorder, and so on. Like most young men in prison. 2/3 of young men in prison are diagnosed, 2/3 of young men in prison, in Britain at least, probably the same in Sweden, are diagnosed as having 2 or more mental illnesses. What freedom does this young man have? His life was blighted from the beginning. So if we're going to go for the second, freedom, with which I have a lot of sympathy, then it's got to be creating the conditions for people to have meaningful freedoms. And that starts to sound like Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen talks about freedom, and he says freedom to lead the life one has reason to value, the freedom to be and to do. But the freedom to be and to do can only happen if we have social action, which is not the libertarian approach to freedom. And that leads me on to a consideration of rights. Do we have a right to health? And do we have a right, therefore, to the social determinants of health? Well, a right implies someone's duty. If there's a right, there's got to be a corresponding duty. And that means if we're going to go down the route of freedoms and rights, we've got to think about duties, both the individual's duty to the society, the responsibility that goes with the rights, and the society's responsibility to the individual. But I think there's much merit in the second. The third is rewarding virtue. Well, that's what we do, don't we? I mean, one way or another, we pay chief executives more than we pay clerical officers. The problem with rewarding virtue is, you heard this morning about, from the Luxembourg income study, about the huge rise in income inequalities. Sweden, which is, as we heard this morning, at the lower end of OECD countries in terms of income inequality, has had a steep rise. The US and the UK have had incredibly steep rises in income inequality. And if you hear what those highly paid chief executives are saying is, we're worth it. We're being rewarded because of our virtue. We're good people. We may have caused the financial crisis, the global finance, but let's put that to one side. We're good people. We're rewarding virtue. Well, I don't know anybody who thinks that everyone should be paid the same. That experiment was tried in Europe from 1917 to 1990, and it failed as an experiment. And in fact, it wasn't implemented that way. So I don't know anybody who thinks everybody should be paid the same. But if we are going to reward virtue, we've got to make sure it's done within socially acceptable limits. And I would argue we need to look at the likely impact on health and the fair distribution of health. So coming all the way back to the question I was asked at the beginning, why aren't people convinced about social justice killing people? And my answer is because politicians, people, have different views of what they mean about social justice. If you think that we just have a simple adding up principle, you don't care about distributions. If you think that freedom means getting the government out of people's lives, you don't care about the fact that poor people suffer poor health as a result. And if you think that it's fair to reward virtue, you don't think about the impact on the people who are not being rewarded. So there are very different conceptions, and that's why I would argue that health and ill health should be the arbiter.
So then we could conclude that before we can do something about social injustice, we have to have some definition work or thinking about what we actually mean with social justice.
Well, excuse me, immodestly, I'm offering you one, which is not so much a definition, but to take the approach to social justice and injustice that has the most positive effect on health and the fair distribution of health. Now, we need to be careful that this is not circular. You know, it's a tautology. How do you know we've got a socially just situation? Well, because we've got a just distribution of health. But if we define health inequity the way I did this morning, as those systematic inequalities in health between social groups that we judge to be avoidable by reasonable means, then a situation that is retarding our progress to avoiding them is unjust. And I think that's closest to the one that empowers people, that creates the social conditions for people to have control over their lives, to have meaningful freedoms.
Sir Michael Marmot, thank you very much for doing that. Thank you.
Pleasure.